Rainwater dripped from the marble steps of First National Bank in downtown Chicago as people in expensive coats rushed past without looking down. Near the glass doors stood a little girl in torn shoes and a faded brown shirt 2 sizes too big for her thin body. Her dark hair was wet from the cold wind, and in her trembling hand she held a small bank card like it was the most important thing in the world. She looked no older than 11, but her eyes carried the exhaustion of someone who had already seen too much life. She took a deep breath, stepped inside the giant building, and whispered to herself that today had to work. Today, she needed to know if there was still hope left. Across the shining marble floor, wealthy clients moved with confidence, but every eye turned toward her the moment she walked in. Some stared with pity, others with judgment. At the center desk stood a sharply dressed millionaire investor named Jonathan Reed, a man known across Illinois for his luxury hotels, expensive suits, and a heart people often called colder than winter. When he noticed the little girl approaching the teller desk, he smirked, assuming she had wandered in by mistake. But then she lifted her chin and quietly said, "I just want to see my balance." Jonathan laughed under his breath. He expected nothing more than a few forgotten dollars. But when the account screen lit up, the laughter vanished from his face. Before we continue, if you believe kindness can change lives and that everyone deserves a second chance, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories that stay with your heart long after they end. The girl's name was Grace Parker. She had been living in a small church shelter on the south side of Chicago for nearly 6 months after losing both her mother and grandmother within the same year. Her mother, Rebecca, had worked 2 jobs as a hospital cleaner and a night waitress, fighting every day to keep food on the table. Grace never knew her father. Rebecca never spoke much about him, only saying that some people leave because they are weak, not because you are unworthy. Grace remembered her mother's hands most of all, always tired, always warm. When Rebecca became sick, everything changed quickly. What started as exhaustion turned into hospital visits, unpaid bills, and silence. Cancer did not care that Grace was still a child. It did not care that Rebecca still had dreams for her daughter. By the time Grace turned 10, she was learning how to make soup alone and how to sit beside hospital beds pretending not to be afraid. Before Rebecca passed away, she gave Grace one thing, a sealed envelope and an old bank card. She told her never to use it unless life became truly impossible. She said there was something left behind by someone from the past, something she had never touched because pride had kept her away from it. She made Grace promise to wait until she was ready. Then, one rainy November night, Rebecca was gone. Grace stayed with her grandmother, Martha, for a while, but grief is heavy, and age is cruel. Martha passed only 8 months later from heart failure, leaving Grace with nothing except that envelope, the bank card, and memories too big for a child to carry alone. The church shelter took her in. Pastor Samuel and his wife Ruth gave her a small bed near the window and made sure she never slept hungry. But Grace hated feeling like a burden. She watched other children get adopted, reunited, rescued. She stayed behind. She worked after school cleaning tables at a nearby diner for extra tips, saving every coin in a small metal box. One night, after the diner owner told her he might have to let her go because business was slow, Grace opened the old envelope for the first time. Inside was a letter written in her mother's careful handwriting. It explained that years ago, before Grace was born, Rebecca had briefly worked as a housekeeper for a wealthy elderly widow named Eleanor Whitmore. Eleanor had no children, and over time, she became strangely attached to Rebecca because she reminded her of the daughter she had lost decades earlier. Before Eleanor died, she quietly opened a trust account in Rebecca's name, and insisted it was meant for Rebecca's future child, someone who deserved a chance life had denied her. Rebecca never touched it, believing she needed to survive on her own strength. But now, she wanted Grace to use it if the world ever became too dark. The next morning, Grace walked to First National Bank with the card in her pocket. Jonathan Reed happened to be there because he was finalizing a multi-million-dollar investment deal. He was surrounded by lawyers, assistants, and people who laughed too loudly at his jokes. Jonathan had built his fortune fast and protected it fiercely. He respected power, not vulnerability. When he saw Grace standing near the teller counter, soaked from the rain and clutching that worn card, he assumed she was there to ask for spare change. The young teller, Melissa, looked uncertain but kind. She took the card and typed the account number into the system. Jonathan stood nearby, amused enough to watch. Grace simply waited, her hands shaking. Melissa's expression changed first. Her eyes widened. She blinked. Then she checked again. Jonathan noticed and stepped closer, curiosity replacing mockery. The balance on the screen showed an amount so large it looked unreal. $3,420,000. Silence filled the marble hall. Jonathan stopped smiling. Grace didn't even understand the number at first. She only knew Melissa suddenly looked at her differently, like the world had shifted under everyone's feet. Jonathan asked whose account it was. Melissa quietly replied that it was a protected trust account legally assigned to Grace Parker. The millionaire stared at the girl in torn clothes like he was seeing her for the first time. Grace asked the only thing that mattered to her. She asked if it was enough to keep her from going back to the shelter. Melissa, now holding back tears, told her softly that it was enough to change her entire life. Something in Jonathan cracked at that moment. Not because of the money, but because of the way she asked. No excitement. No greed. Just relief. Just survival. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt ashamed. He remembered being 12 years old himself, standing in a food pantry line with his widowed mother after his father's debts destroyed everything. He remembered the humiliation. He remembered promising himself he would become so rich he would never feel powerless again. Somewhere along the way, he had succeeded, and lost the part of himself that remembered compassion. He offered to help Grace personally, but she stepped back. She had learned early that rich people offering help often wanted something in return. Jonathan understood. Instead of forcing trust, he quietly asked Melissa to connect Grace with the bank's legal advisor so her account would be protected from exploitation. He arranged for a private financial guardian approved by the court, not someone connected to him. He made sure she would be safe first. For weeks, Grace refused to speak much to him. But Jonathan kept showing up, not with gifts, but with consistency. He visited Pastor Samuel's shelter and donated repairs anonymously. He funded scholarships for the children there without putting his name on the building. He sat through church dinners where nobody cared about his money and everyone noticed how awkward he looked holding paper plates. Ruth was the first to forgive him. Pastor Samuel was the first to challenge him. Grace was the last. One evening, Jonathan found her sitting outside the shelter watching trains pass beyond the fence. She asked him why he laughed at her that day. He told her the truth. Because he had become the kind of man who judged pain by appearance, and worth by clothing. Because success had made him arrogant. Because sometimes people become the very thing they once feared. Grace nodded like she already understood that better than most adults. She told him her mother used to say broken people often break others because they never learned how to heal. That sentence stayed with Jonathan for months. Grace eventually moved into a small townhouse placed under legal trust until adulthood. She chose not luxury, but safety. She stayed in public school. She kept helping at the diner, even though she no longer needed the money, because she said gratitude should not disappear when comfort arrives. Jonathan paid for her education fund, but only after she agreed it would be treated as mentorship, not charity. Together, they created something unexpected. Using part of Eleanor Whitmore's trust and Jonathan's investment, they founded the Rebecca Hope Foundation, a center for single mothers, homeless children, and families trying not to fall apart. Grace insisted it be named after her mother. Jonathan agreed instantly. At the opening ceremony, reporters expected a glamorous speech about philanthropy. Instead, Grace stood at the podium in a simple blue dress and spoke about loneliness. She spoke about how poverty often feels invisible until it stands in the middle of a bank lobby asking for dignity. She spoke about her mother's hands and how love sometimes survives longer than people do. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Before we reach the ending, I want to ask you something special. Please comment below with the words. Kindness changes everything. If you believe one act of compassion can rewrite someone's future. Years passed. Grace grew into a strong, thoughtful young woman studying social work at Northwestern University. She visited the shelter every Sunday. She still kept the old torn shirt folded in a memory box, not as shame, but as proof of where storms had tried to leave her. Jonathan changed too. His business empire remained successful, but people noticed he stopped chasing headlines. He sold one of his luxury towers and used the funds to expand housing programs across Illinois. Magazine interviews called it a surprising transformation. He never mentioned Grace's name publicly, but privately he said one little girl had reminded him what wealth was supposed to be for. On Grace's 21st birthday, Jonathan handed her a small envelope. Inside was a single-dollar bill framed behind glass. It was the first dollar he had earned after his family lost everything as a teenager. He told her he had kept it for decades as a reminder never to be poor again. But now he wanted her to have it as a reminder never to let money decide human value. Grace cried harder than she had in years. She hugged him like family. Because somehow, through grief and pride and second chances, that was what they had become. And sometimes, life doesn't send rescue in the form we expect. Sometimes it arrives in embarrassment, in regret, in the moment someone finally chooses to see you instead of judging you. Sometimes the miracle is not the money in the account, but the humanity it awakens in the people around it. That rainy day in the bank had started with laughter. It ended with redemption. And long after the screen went dark, the number everyone remembered was not the millions sitting in Grace's account. It was the value of a child who walked into a room full of powerful people and quietly asked for nothing more than hope. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, share it with someone who still believes in kindness, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful emotional journeys like this one. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need them most. Because sometimes, the smallest voice in the room carries the greatest miracle of all.